The president of Ukraine is accusing Russia of sending troops into his country. Moscow denies any involvement, but today the leader of the main separatist group said thousands of Russian soldiers are indeed fighting Ukrainian forces. Nala Ayed has more from London, and we have a warning. There's an image in this item viewers may find disturbing.
This, suddenly, is fast-shifting battleground, where once Ukrainian forces had the separatist rebels surrounded, now some of them are forced to pull back. The situation in the area of the anti-terrorist operation has deteriorated within the past 24 hours, says Ukrainian military spokesman Andrei Lysenko. Ukrainian and Western officials say there are increasingly conspicuous signs Russian might and men are behind a new front. Ukraine released this video today, a surreptitious look at what appears to be a surreptitious incursion onto Ukrainian soil. Serious enough, the Ukrainian president cancelled a trip abroad to meet with defense officials. In these days, at these times, the real fight for the real independence of our country is going on, says Petro Poroshenko. NATO says these new images prove Russian heavy machinery and men are operating in Ukraine. The word invasion wasn't mentioned. It seems Russia would prefer to keep the conflict going, says this NATO official.
Russia's ultimate aim is to alleviate pressure on separatist fighters in order to freeze this conflict, which would result in further tragedy for the people of eastern Ukraine.
Civilians like this woman, found dead after the conflict invaded the safety of her kitchen. Russia denies any role in any of the fighting. Pro-Russian rebels are fighting with renewed energy, and they credit that to help from Russians. Some of them servicemen on holidays, says this rebel leader. We never hid the fact, he says, without which it would be difficult to fight now. In Kiev, a show of support for Ukrainian troops, as Western leaders condemn Russia's involvement as unacceptable and reckless. Nala Ayed, CBC News, London.
So that's the latest on the situation on the ground. But how will the U.S. and its allies respond? Is Ukraine facing a Russian invasion, and are sanctions enough to stop the military incursion? The Ukrainian ambassador to Canada, Vadim Prystaiko, will be here in just a few minutes. But joining me now from Washington is David Kramer. He's a former Assistant Secretary of State and now President of the think tank Freedom House in Washington. David, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk about the sanctions, first of all, that have been applied already in the talk of more. There's a suggestion that, well, they may be having impact, the economic sanctions. They're not very effective in changing Vladimir Putin's behaviors. Is your sense that sanctions are working, and if not, if more sanctions might be the answer?
Well, the sanctions are certainly having an impact on the Russian economy. The capital flight has continued, investment is down, and we're seeing the Russian economic officials and finance officials saying it is having an impact. The problem is sanctions are as much punitive as they are psychological, and the psychology of the sanctions has been mishandled by the West because the EU and the US keep giving the impression that, yes, they say there will be more sanctions if Russia continues its actions, and yet their actions undermine that psychology. The push for negotiations, the push for talks. The Ukrainians had military momentum on their side, and yet Chancellor Merkel, when she was in Kiev last Saturday, was pushing for Poroshenko and Putin to meet in Minsk this past Tuesday, and that helps the Russians because the momentum was working against them.
Okay. Before I leave the sanctions questions, today Ukraine's Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk asked the G7, EU, Canada, and others to freeze all Russian assets until those Russian forces withdraw. Are they likely to agree to that? What's your sense?
The EU and US and Canada have taken some significant steps on sanctions, but I think we've reached the point where we need broader sectoral sanctions, which is essentially to say no more financing for Russian enterprises and no more business with enterprises that are involved in this activity. Gazprom, the largest gas producer and exporter, has not been hit by the sanctions at all. It needs to be, and I think, frankly, Canada and the U.S. should and can take that step. It's easier for them to do than the EU, but it would be great if the EU did the same thing.
Okay. I want to play a clip from U.S. President Barack Obama, who spoke a short while ago at the White House. He did say that the U.S. will take additional steps. He also agreed with you that sanctions have had some impact. Take a listen.
Russia is already more isolated than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Capital is fleeing, investors are increasingly staying out, its economy is in decline, and this ongoing Russian incursion into Ukraine will only bring more costs and consequences for Russia.
Well, David, he said much of what you said to us in our first answer. So my question is, if we believe sanctions are working, what other steps might be available outside of economic sanctions?
I think the president and other Western leaders need to be more blunt about the language they use. This isn't an incursion. This isn't stepping across the border. This is a continued invasion that started the end of February, beginning of March with Crimea, that continued into April and May, into eastern parts of Ukraine. It is an invasion. There's no question about it. Russian officials have been lying about this since day one. They continue to lie and deny that they have sent forces across the border. As your report indicated, a senior separatist official, and it's really a Russian-backed official, acknowledged the presence of Russian forces in Ukraine. So I don't think there's any doubt that this is a continued invasion, and we shouldn't be dancing around the language with Western officials.
Right. We're going to be joined in a minute by Irina Chalupa, but I wanted to ask you one more question, David, about the NATO summit that's coming up next week. Obviously, this will dominate. What are you expecting to hear?
Unfortunately, I don't have high hopes for this. I think NATO itself and General Breedlove and Secretary General Rasmussen have taken very strong and outspoken positions on what Russia's doing. They have been describing the situation as an invasion. But I think the members of the alliance are not likely to do much. What I would like them to see is to announce that they will provide military support for Ukraine so that it can defend itself against Russia. Intelligence support, which Ukraine desperately needs. Ukraine's been asking for both military and intel support, and NATO and the U.S. has been the leader on blocking this, and I think that's a major mistake.
Okay. I want to bring in Irina Chalupa. Can you hear me, Irina? Are you there? No. Okay, I think we're just hooking up her mic, but if Irina Chalupa can hear me, she's a former Ukraine bureau chief for Radio Free Europe and is now with the Atlantic Council. Irina, we were just talking about NATO meeting next week and the G7 in the future. I'm looking ahead with what's been happening on the ground in Ukraine. Is there something that you might expect NATO to now do?
This morning I was listening to NPR, and they had the former American ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, and he was very, very adamant in urging NATO to support Ukraine militarily and with advisors and with training, because this is a fight that is being brought closer and ever closer to NATO's borders and into NATO Central, so to speak, and I hope that NATO will listen to what Kurt Volker was saying this morning and take this very, very seriously. I think they're going to have a very big agenda at the summit in Wales.
One other interesting thing, the Czech government today said it was supportive of expanding NATO into the Baltic states and other countries if that's what they want. And is that more likely to happen now, Irina, with what we've seen on the ground in Ukraine?
I really can't say. I think that the Baltic states and Poland would certainly feel much more secure if there was a physical NATO presence on their territory and not just an article that they have yet to see fulfilled. But it remains to be seen what the NATO leadership decides to do in this situation. I personally believe that that would be a great deterrent in terms of limiting Russia's aggression in Europe. But as I said, it's not my decision.
All right. Now, I'd like to get both of you in this, but let me start with David. Are we seeing potential for another Cold War out of this? Because certainly Samantha Power today talking about how Russia has obfuscated, manipulated, and outright lied. So how dangerous, how much more of an escalation does it take before we revert back to the bad old days of the Cold War?
Well, we're at the worst point since the end of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the USSR, the end of the Cold War. We don't have the ideological component that was at the center of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West, but relations are at their worst point by far. I don't see how they rebound anytime soon. And we have to remember that the initial sanctions imposed by the West were done because of Russia's invasion of Crimea. The additional sanctions have been imposed because of what Russia's been doing in eastern Ukraine. So even if Russia were to pull out of eastern Ukraine tomorrow, the sanctions, I hope, would still stay in place because of what Russia's done in annexing and invading Crimea, and we can't forget the situation there.
Irina, what do you think?
Well, I think that we use the phrase Cold War very sort of loosely and almost carelessly, and I would disagree with David that I believe that we do have an ideological component in this latest confrontation between Russia and the West, and it's a confrontation of two systems. Russia has in very many ways reverted back to not only a Soviet but also a imperialist and chauvinist ideology, and it has negated all of the Western principles that organizations like NATO, that the European Union are built on. So there is a very, very strong ideological component. Putin has very, very openly negated everything that the West stands for and is preparing an entirely new narrative, not only in terms of media but also in terms of the reality on the ground. So it's another confrontation. Call it what you will, Cold War II, Cold War III, whatever, but there clearly is not a capacity to think alike and also to follow the same road of democratic development and cooperation.
Very quickly, David, do you agree? I mean,
well, I mean, Putin is, I would argue, his approach is much more negative and anti than it is anything positive. Irina's right in that he tries to undermine NATO, he tries to undermine the EU, he tries to undermine his neighbors. But none of it is with a positive agenda. And the reality is that at the end of the day, he is in fact repelling his neighbors rather than attracting them. He's doing more to unite Ukraine, I would say, than anyone in Ukraine has done in the past 2 decades. And Ukraine is increasing its support for NATO membership. I think it's an enormous mistake, as some have advised, to take NATO off the table. I'm not saying push for it now, but it shouldn't be up to the United States and Russia to determine whether Ukraine has prospects to join NATO one day. That's the wrong approach to take.
All right, I have to leave it there, I'm afraid. David Crane and Irina Chalupa in Washington tonight. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you.